Hi, welcome to Startup Strides. Today, my guest is Emily Tsen. She's a GTM Lead at Omnea. Welcome, Emily.
Thanks for having me here.
Yeah, really excited to have you, to talk to you. Obviously, we're going to talk about the startup you're working at and your background and everything else you do. But I think it's always nice to start with introduction, and because you have a very impressive background, very impressive resume. And I guess, just if you started with an engineering degree at Oxford, then you went into fintech strategy at JP Morgan, then you worked at VC, now you're doing startup operations essentially. And I guess looking back in your career, was there like a common thread tying those moves together, or did each feel like next interesting challenge?
Yeah, so I guess I spend a lot of time now in the fintech space, but I actually fell into that space by accident. So I was quite interested in how great companies was built, how founders did things from scratch. And so I spent a lot of my time at uni basically just going after work experience at very early stage startups. And a few of them happened coincidentally to be in the fintech space. I had no idea what fintech meant at the time. And that basically led to an opportunity at JP Morgan. There was a very early team basically exploring how we could partner with fintech startups to bring tech into the bank and use that to either build new products, drive new revenue streams, or sort of automate some of our processes internally. Did that for just over 2 years. And that was a great opportunity to kind of work quite closely with founders, but it was always very much from a JP Morgan perspective, like what's a great JPM fit for us. And I decided I wanted a bit more of an objective, what makes a great company and how do investors actually think about funding them. So I moved over into an early stage fund called MMC. And I think at some point as an investor, you always get the sense of it's hard to be a very competitive partner at some point without having operational experience. And so that was kind of what led me to join an early stage startup.
Got it. They're related, but there's still big transitions, moving from finance to more corporate environment to VCs and from VC to startups. What frameworks or mental models do you use and how you decide when it's the time to switch gears?
Yeah, I guess it felt quite like a natural transition. So I don't think I thought about it too much. But I spent just over 2 years at JP and kind of felt like I had sort of learned everything that I could learn without spending. It felt like I would have to spend maybe another 5 years getting like a 10% difference. So I feel like once you've sort of kind of gone up that steep initial curve and you feel like you're starting to plateau a bit, that's probably how I think about things.
Fair enough. You're one of this, I guess, kind of interesting. Not everybody usually you come across. They have both VC and startup experience. You have both, and I feel like both of them provide different kind of perspectives. And how did your time in VC shape the way you think about startups? And were there any blind spots that only became clear once you stepped into the operator role?
Yeah, I think being an investor is great because you think about things at like a 10,000 foot view. And I think you always try and spin an interesting narrative onto things. So there's an interesting story of how the founders came together, how they built the business. You do this like great market landscape and you think very strategically, like theoretically, how does the startup fit into that overall context? You come up with your beliefs, your convictions, your thesis. But I think it's all very like theoretical. And I think like the reality of it is that like honestly up until probably series C it's still quite messy. There are probably still a lot of things you haven't figured out, and so like the reality of the day to day just isn't as like glamorous or as like high level as you think it is. But I think it's just a great way of like understanding and when you speak to like customers and when you speak to competitors you have a much better like grounding how things are.
Um, there's got to be a bit of an identity shift from going to a person who gives advice to the one executing it, right? What's that been like for you, and has it changed the way you define impact or success?
Yeah, I think it's become a lot easier to define impact and success, which might be controversial. But I think as an investor, there's lots of different ways you could like add value. You could be great, for example, at doing like deep market maps and coming up with really controversial like convictions on the market, and that could lead you to back a great company that everyone sort of passes on. Or you could be great at getting in front of founders that are really hard to get in front of. That's probably like the main skill that you develop. Or you could just be a great network. like networker, and be that super introduction person and give founders value from that perspective. But it's sort of like there's lots of different ways that you could add value, and often it's a bit difficult to put like a quantitative, like, okay, you've done like X over your time there. I think when you move into a startup, everything is very verticalized. There's probably like 5 main functions at a startup, and so you fit into one of those functions and you fit within a role in that function. So it actually becomes, in my mind, a bit more structured, and it also becomes a bit more easy to actually see like where your work is adding value or not adding value. So yeah, in my opinion, it becomes a bit more like quantitative.
Interesting. You mentioned structure, but my next question was going to be about how, especially like early stage startups, tend to be more unstructured compared to like corporate positions, and you kind of end up doing a bit of everything, right? And not always you'll know everything that you have to do. So how have you approached learning on the fly, especially in areas where you didn't have a playbook?
Yeah, I think there's no like book on that. There's no like, oh, these are the 4 things you need to do, and that's basically how you learn things. But I think like I feel like people sometimes get like an imposter syndrome coming into like a VC role or like an operating role. But like none of the people who've like ever done something has had a time when they've, or a better way to phrase that, I guess, is everyone who's ever done something has had a time when they've not been able to do that thing. And so it's sort of like everyone sort of learning on the fly, everyone sort of in some ways doing something that they've not done before. I think even if you've done that specific function at a different startup, uh,
Mhm.
it's so like industry and like company specific, that it's not necessarily always like 100% transferable. So I feel like because everyone's sort of learning with you, it feels a bit more like you're learning together.
So I guess the key to dealing with imposter syndrome is just knowing that everybody else kind of is feeling the same way.
I think everyone's gone through it.
Yeah, yeah.
Everyone who tells you that they haven't is just lying. But
Fair enough. You mentioned a few things about VC and VC. When you look at the nature of the job, right? It's about pattern recognition, trend recognition, and hopping on the trends earlier before anybody else. Um, and startups are often, especially like good startups, are often from about building from zero to essentially from zero, right? And what's been the hardest and I guess most rewarding parts of stepping into that 0 to 1 environment?
I guess moving from a more like just assessing patterns to actually like doing things,
Mhm.
I think there's just a much higher expectation on things that have to be done. And I think your role becomes a lot more like focused. So instead of having this like 10,000 foot view and looking across the market and kind of like being in the know and lots of different things, you're sort of like a horse with like, the like eye masks, and you're like looking at one thing and you're like, okay, this is the one thing I have to do this week. And you can kind of like go and get that done. I think I would say that's like the pros of it. Obviously, the cons is that it's a bit more like um, you're always up against something new, or you're always sort of like the rookie in like the box. So you're always going to be like the smaller player. Let's say if you're going against an RFP with your competitors who have raised X hundreds of millions more funding than you. Yeah, there's always got to be something that's like against you, and I feel like you just have to like kind of approach it with quite like a positive like can-do mindset, which I think is quite different. When you're an investor and you're always sort of like, okay, my default is to kill it, and you're looking for something that would convince you otherwise. But in a startup, it's more like I think I can do it, and you gotta just try and do it.
Emily, one question I'm curious about is, you obviously you have your job and you have things to do, and I'm not sure how typical weeks look like. I'm guessing in a startup there's not such a thing as it having a typical week, but uh, at the same time you also have to like you're learning new things and you're constantly evolving in your role. How do you manage and balance your time, both fulfilling your own like responsibilities, but also at the same time learning too?
I think it's like one and the same. Like you're always doing something that you may not have necessarily done before. And so there's obviously like the role is quite structured in some ways. Like you have a set of tasks to do. You kind of get a sense quite quickly of the playbook that you can build to kind of get there. But for example, more specifically in like go to market, there's always a new like customer you're speaking to with a very different like context, very different perspective of the market. And so it's always like you're always basically learning on the fly, right? There's always something new that you didn't know before.
Got it. We briefly mentioned that you're GTM lead at Omnia, but we didn't talk about Omnia. So I guess for the listeners unfamiliar with Omnia, great company, by the way. I've written about it on Substack. How would you describe what the company is building and what drew you specifically to join this company?
Yeah, so we are a spend control platform. We help companies manage the long tail of indirect spend. So if you think of yourself as a consumer, you might have a number of software subscriptions, your Netflix, your Spotify, et cetera, et cetera. An enterprise would have the same thing, but obviously at a much larger scale. Unfortunately, the way they manage things today probably doesn't look too dissimilar to the way you might manage it yourself. So often it's an Excel spreadsheet or using very legacy toolings. And that might mean that they miss duplicate spends or they miss upcoming renewals that they actually didn't really use in the team anymore, or they miss doing proper due diligence on a vendor, and then there's a data breach and things go wrong. So we basically help to manage that end to end, all the way from how do you request a new tooling as an employee, how do you get that approved, and then how do you, as the admin, the procurement, or the finance teams, manage all your existing tool stacks, both from a renewals and also like a compliance perspective. I feel like that was a long explanation of what we do. But what led me to join, I think I was really impressed by the culture they're building. I think we like to have the saying that everyone's very nice and normal at Omnia. That might also be a very British thing. But everyone is genuinely someone that you can kind of just walk up to, approach, and just have like a pint with. They're all very humble. I think like you wouldn't necessarily meet them and be like, oh yeah, this guy is like a founder of like an Excel-backed startup. But he is, they're just all like quite down to earth.
Very cool. And your role in the firm is GTM lead, and I believe you are specifically focusing on US expansion. GTM is one of those like interesting roles. I feel like you hear a lot, but you don't like quite usually like if you're not in the space, you don't really understand what the job entails. So I guess what does GTM mean, and what does building a GTM engine actually involve at this stage? How do you approach it?
Yeah, I would say there's probably four different components. I think the thing that comes to mind is probably sales, which is sort of the main engine of how do you generate lead gen, how do you bring that through the funnel, and how do you like actually like close customers. And then I think if you think about that end to end, the way you generate lead gen is either you do like outbounds or you do like inbounds. And so there's a marketing team within go to market that would focus on kind of building up our brand, building up our presence, and kind of generating that touch point and kind of hoping that that generates into an inbound lead. So it's sales, marketing, and then obviously after a certain point, you have lots of different people working across lots of different toolings with their own different processes. It becomes quite messy, and so you start needing like enablement or like an ops team to basically support your sales and marketing to define like what's the best playbook, what's the best toolings, you should do it like X and X, and how do you think about optimizing processes, for example. And then I would say the fourth element is obviously hiring to support your sales, marketing, ops teams.
So GTM, as you mentioned, there involves quite a few different elements, right? Are they all equally important at the same time, or do they take priorities depending on where you're at, and it's constantly evolving, sort of?
Yeah, I mean, I would say like at the earlier stages, you probably just have like a salesperson. Like there might be just one person managing everything end to end from your lead gen, which is like your BDR work, all the way to sort of just closing the pipeline. And that person might also double as doing some early content and getting some of that inbound lead as well. I think obviously as you start scaling, it becomes a bit more structured. And so you would generally then tend to hire a marketing person and then followed by ops and then probably a hiring person at some point as well.
And if somebody's interested in a GTM role, maybe some undergrad, maybe some master's student, and what kind of experiences they should try to aim to get before they start an experience a job like that?
What part of the go to market?
If like let's say there's a GTM position, GTM lead at a startup they really want to work at, how they should curate their applications, is their background essentially for that?
Yeah, I think it's super different, right? Depending on which parts of the go-to-market team you want to apply to. Doing sales, it's very different to marketing, very different to enablement. I would say if you are interested in a career in sales, honestly, there are lots of different roles you could take that are probably quite transferable. Anything that's sort of like front facing, we've hired people who are like ex-consultants, ex-IBD. It does transfer it does transfer over quite well. And I would say sales is also like a bit of a consultative process. So like I think like ex sort of like MVP folks, like they do tend to do quite a lot of sales position. Or sort of like early stage investors who, try to get in front of someone that didn't want to speak to them. I would say that's the other part of sales. Yeah. And then I think for marketing, obviously just getting experience in marketing roles, I think it's probably quite like a verticalized function, more sort of like you need to do marketing to get into a marketing role. And I would say for enablement, you could probably do a number of things that are adjacent to sales and marketing. And having seen that process sort of from the outside gives you a much better perspective to kind of come in and try and optimize that.
Got it. We are nearing towards the end of our episode. It's been one of the I guess most efficient episodes I've made, and I already mentioned that your obviously resume is quite impressive, and I feel like there might be some people in your position who are debating whether to move from VC to operator roles or from operator startup roles to VCs. What advice would you give to them? What kind of things they should keep in mind? And I guess what's something about that switch that doesn't get talked about enough?
Your first question is what advice would you give people considering
that switch between either startup to VC from VC to startup?
Yeah, I think it depends on what you want to do long term. I think it's sort of like two sides of the same coin. And I think if you're interested in a career in startups in the long term, either side is probably a good way of getting in. I think if you're coming in as like a junior sort of investor role, it is, I think, quite difficult to become a competitive partner without having some form of operating experience. I do find that it does become quite difficult to give advice if you don't necessarily have that experience, you haven't actually seen things play out. And so often you're sort of giving advice from a playbook or things you've seen from other companies. But yeah, it's sort of like the longer you are in the game on either side, the better you'll be at it. I think the other way around is quite interesting because you're basically leaving behind the sort of excitement of like building and doing things to then going to a role where you're sort of like a bit more removed. And I would say that's a bit more rare. Like usually it's like VC to operators. But yeah, I feel like if you're considering going into an investing role, you have to be prepared to be like, okay, your hands will be tied behind your back a bit. You might see something that's like really frustrating and you can't necessarily do anything about it. You're just like the person giving advice. So yeah, that's the sort of like way I would think about it, I think.
Fair enough. Emily, you seem like you're quite I guess when you made your decisions, you made them quite efficiently, quite like you thought about them quite well. So maybe you will not have an answer to this question, but I still want to ask. Looking back, do you think you would do anything differently?
I think it's hard to answer these questions because I think it's sort of like, oh, if you would do something differently, it meant that you had the knowledge from hindsight, and I think hindsight is like 2020, right? It's very good. So I don't think so.
No, fair enough. I guess I'll do a bit of a rapid fire reflections and just a couple of questions. One belief about startups that changed after joining one.
It's a good question. I think it's in a way much more focused and much more structured than I had expected. I think that was the one thing that surprised me the most. I expected it to be super chaotic, sort of like nobody knows what's going on. Every day is sort of like a completely new playbook. But no, it's actually more structured than you would expect.
Got it. This is a question more from your investor days. Founder trait you now appreciate even more?
I think positivity, or like the optimism to be like, yeah, I want to do something that's really crazy. Like nobody believes in this, and still continue to believe in that yourself, and believe you can do that. I think it's just so difficult. Like every day, if you're sort of like in sales, for example, you're pitching against someone that has like raised much more money than you. It's sort of like you're always up against something that you're the underdog of. So I think having that like trait is actually like probably the single most important thing you could have.
Fair enough. And I guess my final question would be perhaps a book, resource, or person that really shaped how you think.
Yeah, this is cliche, but I really like the YC podcast.
Oh, really?
I feel like in reflection, I should now say it's the Startup Shards podcast that I really like and listen to.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you. And why is it why YC podcast? Is it the way they approach the guests or?
I like the way they I feel like they give quite controversial opinions in the market, and I really like that. Like whether it's just like the way they think about toolings or the way they think about like companies building things, and I feel like when they interview founders, you get like the pre early days of like pre seed pre project, when it was just like one person basically going around with like a notebook, like getting customer feedback. Yeah, I really enjoy that.
This has been really wonderful and quite efficient conversation, Emily. Thank you so much for today for this episode. Was the hopes of staying in touch. This has been Emily Tsen from Omnea.
No worries. Thank you so much for having me here.